perception, urbanism, design, and culture. Prior to academic career, he was a part of the multinational corporate with consulting experience in the field of design, cognitive and behavioral study, or experiential aspects. His notable architectural designs include Ponchanon Burma Government University and Coach Bihar Engineering College in the state. He has several prominent accolades, publications, and projects to his credit. His recent edited book on built environment of a global south is noticeable addition to Springer Nature. He has been invited as a speaker to Smart Cities Congress in Paris in the year 2015, and his artworks have been exhibited in Berlin as well. He has traveled extensively to North America, South America, United Kingdom, Africa, and Asia for his projects, works, and researches. In fact, we are very lucky to have him as moderating our session today. This will be truly an experience, I can bet on that. So without further ado, let's get to the session. But before that, I would request Professor Chakraborty to speak a few words as he is the principal for School of Architecture and Planning at Sister Nivedita University. Professor Chakraborty, over to you.
That was wonderful. That was a brilliant introduction. I will not take much time. I will only like to say that we are a very young university, being formed in 2019, and our architecture department along with it. We exist with a department with a fantastic line of faculty, which we very critically absorbed into our system, and we are going to impart to undergraduate courses. We are imparting to undergraduate courses, and therefore I am really looking forward to an long-established university like the University of Liverpool, which Dr. Shoman Bandyopadhyay heads, and is also the chair of the Sterling, and therefore there's a lot to learn and understand in this globalized world which is shrunk, but at the same time, therefore it's also an opportunity to hear how University of Liverpool undertakes critical thinking while undertaking design and disseminate to the students, which will be also useful for some of the students and architects who have joined, who could be the future faculty in this department as well. And I leave it at that, without getting into kind of a assurance that if any one of you would like to consider architecture or planning as an option, aspire to be an architect and a planner, we are there. We are there to give you as much as we know and beyond through all these kind of networks, which has now been much more easier and possible in this day and age. I welcome Dr. Bandyopadhyay as well as Dr. Moina Ghosh to this important discourse on architectural design thinking and architectural humanism, stories from Liverpool University. I request Dr. Bandyopadhyay to start his deliberation.
Thank you, Manish, and thank you, everyone. And it's really a great pleasure. I'll try and share my screen first, and then can you see the presentation?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, right. You can.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. It's a great pleasure, obviously, and a great honor to be invited over to do the talks. And obviously, things have been helped enormously by the recent pandemic. If there is an upside to this pandemic, then there is this incredible connection that we've been making. And very recently, we had Kenneth Frampton, who was delivering a lecture for us from America. And those who know Kenneth Frampton, who's about 91, he's one of the foremost architectural theoreticians of this time, I would say. And it was a great pleasure to have him, to host him as well in the similar manner. So it is one of those things. And what I wanted to do today is to talk about, yes, it is about how I think about design. And I think it is every academic, I would say, would have a slightly different way of approaching design. We approach design in different ways. There is also every university, every department of architecture will have a culture of their own. So we kind of build that as well. What I'll try to show is mostly my own students' work, some of the work that some of the students have done. Not a huge amount of that. That will be interspersed with some examples drawn from well-known architects in India, like Doshi or Charles Correa, and a little bit of here and there, a couple of other architects and so on. But just to sort of highlight the issues that I'm trying to talk about, and I'll explain that in a bit. But first, I wanted to say a few things very briefly about Liverpool. As Monish was rightly pointing out, that it's an old school of architecture. And I just wanted to, yeah. So, and Monish had mentioned at the beginning when we were introducing ourselves that it is a World Heritage Site. The riverfront, the Liverpool riverfront is a World Heritage Site. The buildings here you can see, I think these three buildings, the Liver Building, Cunard Building, and these are all basically shipping insurance companies. You know, these are shipping. So during the colonial period, when there was a huge, obviously transatlantic trade, but prior to that, also the Indian Ocean trade, Liverpool built itself up. And also, let's not forget, slave trade was an important part of, Liverpool and Bristol. And that's how it all came up. But so in the foreground, the brick building that you see is one of the largest warehouses in the world, pretty much. And there is another one which is truly the largest warehouse. It's called the Tobacco Warehouse, farther up north, that way. But this is called the Albert Dock, where ships would come in and then they would unload the stuff and then go away towards their transatlantic voyages. So Liverpool is a kind of important city in that way. Also, Liverpool, in terms of its architecture, is quite distinctive. We have on the left-hand side the Philharmonic Orchestra building, which is an important building from the 1930s. And as you can say, it's a kind of an architecture of that time, where, again, built by, at that time, one of the members of staff at that time, but previously a student of the School of Architecture as well. And on the right-hand side is a more recent thing, which is Everyman Theater. Everyman, culturally, Liverpool has got a great, I think, a parallel with Calcutta, that it has always been sort of left-dominated. And so the Everyman Theater is really one of those, like the Indian, the People's Theatre movement. There was the kind of People's Theatre movement in Liverpool, which that's why it's called the Everyman, because everyone could actually come in and participate in that. And this building, which was again a RIBA award-winning building by Howard Tompkins, it was done in the last 10, 12 years or so. It's a really interesting building, and it has got the usual theaters and so on inside it. Now, university is also, again, a very old university, again, very strong parallels with university like Calcutta, Mumbai, or Madras. Many of the universities in UK, the older ones, are known as red brick universities. And red brick, the word comes from this particular building, which is the Victoria building, which is in red brick. And hence the universities are called red brick universities. So you would be talking about UCL, you'll talk about red brick university, you'll talk about Bristol, you'll talk about red brick university, so like that. And on the left-hand side, there is this sort of campus. The great thing is that we are in the city, so therefore there is so much interaction that we can have. And all the departments are around this sort of area. There's two large cathedrals in Liverpool. One is here, which is the Metropolitan Cathedral, the Catholic Cathedral, that is. And the university is just all here. The School of Architecture is just over here, that building, and facing this big park. Now, Liverpool School of Architecture is about 126 years old now. It was started off in 1895. The Architectural Association, the AA, is the only oldest school of architecture in that sense. But within the university sector, this is the oldest school of architecture. so 1895 onwards. And you can see a number of people who have had huge influence on architecture. Now, I'll just point out Charles Riley, who was a head of School of Architecture for Liverpool for a very long time, from the early 1900s to 1932, was a big influence on the way that curriculum is shaped today in schools of architecture. So the 5-year course, the way we teach architecture, the integration of technology, integration of history and theory and so on, that kind of program was brought about by Charles Riley. And he is, we still have a Riley chair in our school. We have the Riley Medal, which is the top medal for the best students of architecture who come out. So we have that sort of history. Maxwell Fry, many of you will know who have been in planning or who've been in architecture. Maxwell Fry was involved with Le Corbusier and Jane Drew in the making of Chandigarh. So Maxwell Fry is one of our graduates. There are many others here. They're very well known in this part of the world. Waterhouse, Halford, William Halford, J. Herbert Rouse, and so on. So as you know, one of our ex-colleagues, David Thistlewood, said that to reflect on the history of the School of Architecture is to discover a microcosm of architectural influences and values from across the world. And that is really what the school is. The school is the world in one word, one sort of school. And one of the foremost students of architecture who came out of Liverpool is James Stirling. James Stirling was an important figure right across the world, but especially in the sort of Anglo-Saxon world, I would say. He's built many buildings, from Harvard to to Germany to UK, of course. There are very many buildings. On the left-hand side this is his late 1940s thesis project from the School of Architecture, graduating. But James wasn't particularly a great student, and this is where I think it indicates some of the kind of tensions and tussles of what constitutes architectural quality and everything else that we have to be aware of. But James, what he was doing, James Stirling, was one of the the kind of groundbreaking work, which is now only being realized, or has been realized in the last 20, 30 years or so. So on the right-hand side, so James Stirling is here. On the right-hand side, another person, Colin Rowe, is a very important figure intellectually and as a theoretician. He taught at Liverpool School of Architecture. He was actually the teacher of James Stirling. And one of the books that you might actually come across is called Collage City. It's a very interesting postmodern take on the city and how we understand cities. And it's been influencing quite a lot of others. And he taught mostly, after Liverpool, he taught mostly in America, in the USA. And the other person on the right-hand side is who just recently died, Robert Maxwell, at the age of 96. Bob Maxwell was the dean at Princeton, again, a graduate of Liverpool University. Very recently, as I was saying, when we did the Frampton lecture, this was actually in the memory of Robert Maxwell. And again, he has written quite a lot. So the school has got, both in terms of practice and in terms of theory, there is a huge strength that the school projects. In fact, in terms of the schools of architecture, we have the most RIBA gold medalists coming out, from here. And that's one of the kind of great things. So in the 20s and 30s, so you can see the first building, is this Georgian terrace, which is facing the park. And then in the 1920s to 1930s, under Charles Riley, this kind of quasi-modernist building was constructed in the 1920s and 30s. And you can see the studios on the right-hand side. And it actually had some Indian students at that time too. So it is quite an interesting time. And you can see these are the kind of various rooms that the studios were used for. Now in the 80s, late 80s, we constructed this studio within that courtyard of that building. Inside that there is a courtyard. And in that courtyard came up this studio through the middle of that courtyard. And this is the kind of interior of that studio from the 1980s. And this has been a really important part of the studio. The way that we work in a culture like this is that, the studio is open 24 hours and we work, the students come in anytime and they work from here. And that's one thing. But also we've realized that, now, and this is where, we have what we call crits or reviews. You have to pin your work up, on the wall. and there will be a panel of critics like here. Some will come from outside, some will be internal, and they will talk about your work, and they will talk about how good or bad that is, and that is the culture through which you learn. And then you go back to your studio desk and you work, and you work sometimes 24 hours, as we all know, but from any school of architecture. And I can see an uncle here, and I know that how much work we have done, 24 hours working through the studios. But that is the kind of culture. But also we have realized that in the recent times that our building is no longer able to house all the students. We are about 850 students in the School of Architecture, including PhD students and master students and so on. And that's a huge school. So recently we have got this new building. Hopefully this will come up very shortly. This is an extension by O'Donnell and Toomey, again, a RIBA gold medalist team, practice from Ireland, who are constructing this building. So effectively what will happen, this is the Georgian Terrace. This is our the Riley building, which will be modified. You can see the upper floor part, which is the 1980s studio, and then the lower part will be modified, and this is the new extension. So all this is a School of Architecture sitting in the right at the heart of our university campus. Now you can see one of the things that I would like to say, and I said about context and in my sort of brief biography, that I think it's very important to understand how do you actually put buildings in context, or when you're adding things to a context, how do you actually make that happen? So I'm really looking at that's something that I'll talk about very shortly. That's the plan of the building. So the older building is there, the Riley building, which is where the courtyard used to be here, and then all the things around it. All this is now going to be huge workshops, because we think that making models, making things, digital production, all of this is very important for us. And this is the kind of new part of this building where the first years and the fourth years will be located. Some of the PhD students will be located. Some of the tutors will be located too. So all this is, where things will happen. So just to now come back to my work, and again, in the biography, it was talked about that, I've done various things, and architectural work never ends, architectural writing never ends. There is a lot of work to be done, and there are lots of interesting things that can be done. And my interest geographically is South Asia, of course, India, and Middle East, where I've spent a lot of time, and I've spent a lot of my work is on Middle East. But here, these books are really some of the books, apart from journal papers, that this is the book Site and Composition, where I focus on the idea of how sites are understood and constructed. Sites are never given. Sites are kind of always constructed. This whole idea of humanities, architectural history theory, how does that really influence our design thinking? How do we think about architecture through these kind of ideas of culture, ideas of politics, ideas of social theory, and so on? And this is also moving into the territories of identity. This is another book which was mainly focusing on the idea of identity, and is there something called identity anymore? And why should we think about identity, or how differently should we think about identity? And this, on the right-hand side, is a book that was done quite a few years back, which was on Chandigarh, where I did a bit of work at that time. So that was a book there. And the Middle Eastern work, mainly on Oman, where I have lived and worked for 5-6 years in the 80s, 85 to 90. And then after that, I've continued to do my research there. On the left-hand side, and my work is historical, anthropological, also, archaeological, if you like. And on the right-hand side, this book should come out next year, which is looking into the idea of cosmopolitanism and how Indian Ocean cosmopolitanism kind of shaped some of these cities and towns. Okay, so that's the kind of background of where I am, and I'll then start talking about, my thoughts about architectural humanities and how I see design. Now, two main things here for me. One is site. We construct buildings on sites, so site. And what I contend here is that sites are never given. We make sites, we construct sites, in our own way. Sometimes we think, okay, fine, there is a dimension and a geometry of the site, and that's it. but not that site is just that. Site is much more than that. And we will talk about that as we go through this. And so the important thing is that we have the ability to make construct sites. And on the right-hand side, there's a program. That is that what is the building going to be used for? Okay, so the program can be again modified. The program also has a modifying effect on the building site. So the site is modified by how you introduce activities and program. And there is this tension between site and program, and that's where design really exists. So this space between the site and program is what I think is where the architectural process exists, okay? And I think architectural process is important, that we do not have an answer. We search for an answer. This is why design is a way of researching. Design is a way of thinking through, getting answers or addressing questions, okay? And I'll come to that point in a moment. So what we do is that there are established types of buildings that we have always done over history. So simply, like, let's say a school is like a type of a building, or a hospital is a type of a building, okay? So there are types and typologies. And you can manipulate those types as we do all the time, okay? Then there is the issue of composition of elements. How do you organize these elements together? Then there is the most important thing, I would say, is an experience of atmosphere. When you construct a building, when you create a building, at the end of the day, you do not actually read it as a plan. A person who walks into the building experiences the building. Or a person, when you're giving a digital presentation of that building, you're experiencing the building and its spaces. And therefore, very simply, the atmosphere of the building that you create, consciously thinking about the site and program relationship, that is what gives the meaning. So the meaning can only be conveyed not through a written piece of work, but by the building, as you pass through the building, as you experience the building. And so the meaning and interpretation of this whole process, site and program coming together, what does it mean? What is the program about? How should I think about it? That interpretation should effectively become a cultural and social and even a political commentary, on the situation. And so this whole issue can only be extended and explored through an architectural process, that we have to make drawings, we have to make models, we have to ask those questions by making something. So once you make a model, it's outside of you, that idea, and you think, what the hell is this? What have I done? Can I actually look at it from another angle? Can I turn it around? I'll show you some examples, but the whole idea is that architecture is a process of research. Design is a process of research, and that's something that I think increasingly most universities and most cultures are becoming aware of and becoming, so design thinking as a research process. Okay, so some of the key themes that I would like to talk about here is that buildings are essentially unfinished. Buildings are never complete. Completeness is not part of necessarily an architectural achievement. Okay, and you can see that from traditional cultures. A building, in Arabic, there is a saying that, once you construct your building, you complete your building, you are dead. So building is a kind of ongoing process. It's perpetually in the making. And the designing is therefore always about bits, parts, fragments. You kind of bring those together. And also as a result of that kind of fragment, the idea of fragment is not necessarily that it is broken down into parts, but the idea is that a fragment, a piece that you start thinking about, also extends its connections or alludes to connections, which alludes to a bigger whole. Okay, so a part or a piece or a space or a room that you are actually thinking about has got connections beyond that. So that is the idea of the fragment. And then, therefore, you're looking at not necessarily kind of homogenizing plans and organizing spaces like that so that it flattens out, but you're giving it a texture, a character by disaggregating rooms, extending rooms, stretching it out, okay, and containing rooms. So defining rooms, disaggregating rooms, extending rooms. These are the kind of things that I think often happens as part of the architectural process. And then, as I said, the constructed nature of sites fabricated nature of sites. Site, you're constantly making the site. You're never given a site. And how do you eventually find, how do you actually locate a building? How do you put a building? Where do I put the building in relation to the site? All those things, that is called the grounding. The idea of how do I actually put how do I put the building in its right location? And this is the design process. The design process is thinking about all of that. And two things I would like to actually indicate. One is what I would call instrumental process. Straightforward, you make a drawing, you make a sort of line, you make a connection, straightforward things, that are practical things almost, and they have a role to play in the design process, as well as by doing that, you're also thinking laterally. That is that, well, what if I thought about it in a different way? What if this were to be thought in and I'll give you examples later on. What if I bring in another thought into it? Okay. What if I introduce an understanding from literature into it? What if I introduce an understanding from music into it? What will happen? And those lateral thinking are important to it. And I'll come to that in a moment. So when I mentioned fragmentation, the fragment, I did not mean fragmentation. Okay? Fragment and fragmentation. If you look into Frank Gehry's building, which is a very well-known building from the Walt Disney Concert Hall, and obviously Frank Gehry has made many of these buildings, very many. They're essentially about deliberately breaking up the form into these parts. Okay, and that's not what I mean by fragmentation. What I mean, this is fragmentation. It is a kind of deliberate attempt to break that as a formal calisthenics, if you like, as a formal circus. So that's one thing that I would oppose. And on the other hand, I oppose the very totalitarian buildings, that come out, object buildings. There are special buildings, iconic buildings, but they have very little. And I would say they are kind of, as they say often, the one-liner. There's only one thing to find out. One of the great things about architecture, good architecture, is that you can find many, many, many meanings. Just in Bengali, there is a word in short story that there is shesh hoilo na shesh, that it never ends. It ends, but it never ends. There are a multiplicity of meaning. And that is where architecture also is quite crucial for us. So as I said, site is also the context. Site is the bigger thing. So the first thing is obviously the immediate area of control, easy to trace in its property lines, designated legal means and bounds. But the second one, which is the most encompassing one, which forces that act upon a plot without being confined to it, so that all the forces around it can be called the area of influence. And the third is the area of effect, the domains impacted following design action. So this is the idea of the site. The site is not just the limited boundary of the building, the property, but what happens around it and how it's drawn in, but also how, once you put the building, it actually extends its influence out. And the program, as I said, architecture is not a problem-solving discipline, unfortunately. Although we can solve few problems, but not much. Because if we had solved all our problems in the 6,000 years of architecture, we would have solved all our cultural problems, all our political problems. We never managed to do that. Architecture can address issues, it can raise issues, it can address issues, it can never really solve problems. And so the other thing at the end of the day is also that architecture is a bodily thing, that we experience space through our body. And the relationship between space and, that is, architecture and body, is the integral part of it. So the program is, at the end of the day, I sit on a table at a desk and write something, and that's why it becomes a desk. There's no other reason for it to be called a desk, okay? So this idea that anthropological activities, whatever I do, whatever, if I take a book off a shelf, then that is why that activity makes a shelf, okay? So those kind of anthropological aspects are quite important for me. Okay, so we talked about the instrumental things. Now, many, many architects have worked in that kind of straightforward manner. So there is a problem, you kind of address the problem or raise the kind of issues around that problem. An example, a very good example, is Giuseppe Terrani, who was during the fascist period in Italy, he was a very important architect, but also he contributed to modern architecture in a very important way. And this is a kind of theoretical project. It's called the Danteum. Many of you will know Dante, Divine Comedy. Dante was in the early 1300s, around probably between 1310 and 1320, he wrote the Divine Comedy, and that had these sort of three levels of, sort of the world, the conception of the universe. There's the Inferno, which is the hell, if you like, purgatory, sort of the world around where we sort of live our lived world, live life, and then there is the paradise. So either you can go to the hell or you can go to paradise. Now, this idea of this, which is expressed in the Danteum, the Dante's Divine Comedy, was actually going to be put into this project, the idea of a building. So it's a very straightforward instrumental understanding of what will heaven look like, what will the world look like, what will the hell or the inferno, the burning fire, that place look like. So these are the kind of various images that were constructed as a result of it. As you can see, it's a very, very straightforward planning, which was derived from this understanding of the golden mean, and the golden mean rectangle that proposes to be the kind of ideal space, and sort of using the ideal space to represent the ideal paradise, if you like, in this case. So very simple, straightforward connections being made here. Now, that also brings me to this, again, a pretty straightforward student project. So I'll go back and forth between student projects and other work. Here, this is a student project from last year, one of the thesis projects in the 5th year. Now, we do not necessarily do buildings just, we actually look into large areas of territories. And also students work in their thesis projects in groups. So this is a group of 3 working together. And this was in Spain, which is a small little village, which is in the middle of Spain, which is currently derelict. What do we do with that place? And so this idea of how do we develop a kind of, a way of understanding the place, but also how do we develop a way of intervening within that. And it's done in a very instrumental way. That is that it tries to understand types, tries to understand spatial types that are there. So for example, grids, how often, these are stone structures from the medieval times. So how big were they? How was the grid organized? What kind of changes did the grid take when it moved on? So for example, starting with this, how do you add something to it? How does that actually then modulate and modify, as it goes through? So it sort of sets up a whole series of rules about the basic spatial organizational principle. Very instrumental, straightforward, ideas about it looks like this, it organizes like this. This is the set of rules that they have used over a period of time. Now, one very important thing to understand from here is that traditional architecture, vernacular architecture, but also unconsciously, we have spatial understandings built in our body, built on our head, and that we repeat all the time. Okay, and that's why typologies are relevant, types are relevant, because we repeat it almost unknowingly. And that is something that they were trying to discover. So again, relationships, say, between, this is a medieval town up on a hill ridge. So, how did they engage with the wall? How did they engage with, if there were other kind of functional transformation taking place, how did they do that? So all that kind of sets up the rules, and it creates a kind of, if I go back here, so this is, parts of this is existing. So there is a fort here, there are various other buildings here, but the rest of the buildings are being constructed and being introduced by either taking something down or by introducing completely new buildings. And that's a kind of, this is an entirely computer generated drawing, okay? It's not a hand-drawn drawing, but it is a really lovely drawing, a lovely way of representing, how, pieces can come together. And this takes the basic idea from going from hands-on work. So this was an education place for sort of heritage training, if you like, broadly, but, putting within a kind of cultural tourism trail and so on. But so it goes from physical making of, and restoring things to the more intellectual abstract aspects of it. So that's how the buildings are organized in that sequence. You can see that in the model. The white bits are the bits that they have designed, and then the brown bits are the bits that already exist, and you can see the plans here. So the point was that it actually takes that very simple idea of spatial ordering principles, understanding the rules and how you're modifying those rules and applying those at different locations. So it's a section through where, the edge of the wall, or, the kind of, and a sort of path around the wall, those kind of things, and then into structural areas, where certain elements have been added or modified. Those kind of ideas are being taken forward. And a section through that, beautifully constructed section, of course, and it's a beautiful render as well. But you can see that these models were actually coming up, not as final pieces, but they have always been happening. And I'll show you later on that there are things that happen while you're designing the building. Okay, so that is a kind of very straightforward idea of how you can take certain ideas but do it, construct it really, really beautifully. Now, another person that I'm very influenced by is Peter Eisenmann. And Peter Eisenmann did a lot of work in the 1980s, mainly. It's called the Cities of Artificial Excavation. There was a major exhibition, and this book came out. It's called, entitled the same. And it is really about almost artificially using drawings to create an artificial archaeology of sites. Sort of by superimposing drawings, that you're creating a kind of almost a pattern, and a abstracted pattern, and a kind of connected pattern, which can be then freed up, if you like, resolved into buildings and possibilities of that. And then he built this, there are a number of other buildings of the similar type, but for example, this building, it comes out of this idea of this superimposition of patterns, from the site, and then looking at how those things can be extruded into building forms. And you can see those building forms coming up in quite a dramatic way. Internally, they're not as powerful. Some spaces are, but externally, certainly it's very powerful. This is the Arnav Center for Design and Art in Cincinnati. Now, this process of working through drawings, playing with the drawings, and I think that's one idea that one has to, in design, play is crucial. Okay, you are playing with things. You're playing with a model, you're playing with a drawing, you're playing with your pencil. That is what you're doing. That's, at the end of the day, that's what our work is. Okay, you're playing. Okay, any art form does that. Music does that. If you look into theater, that does that. Every time it is that. So these drawings are exactly like that. These were done about 1990s. These are fully digital times. So you can see that tracing paper, prints and tracing paper has been worked out. So one layer after layer after layer after layer, you're putting on, and therefore this student is constructing elevational parts. This is starting from a disused building in Liverpool. At that time, there were loads of disused buildings. The idea was, how do you transform that into a hotel? That was a short stay accommodation. And so the drawings are really what shaped up the design, not that the program shaped up the design. So the drawings shaped up the design. So the process, this instrumental process of transformation of drawings, made the building. And you can see that even certain movements and actual movements, you can see here, which have been taken into there, and then therefore they have been sort of worked up against vertical pieces. And then you create these kind of spaces, which may be transitory spaces in between parts of buildings and parts of rooms. And that's how it was created. So it was an exploration and sort of experiment with this sort of transformation. Okay, another one. And here we are moving into slightly other territory as well. That there is an instrumental process, but also there is a play of what we have learned from postmodernists. Okay, that if supposing we started here on the wall, this is part of an exhibition. So on the wall, part of the end of year show that we do, on the wall, there is this drawing. This is actually a electric water heater, a kettle. And electric kettle, so it's about that big, and they're asked to draw it up 5 times the size. So not 1:5, 5:1. So it makes a big drawing. So you can't do it with normal drawing paper. So here we have used brown paper to produce the drawing. It's a pencil drawing in brown paper, cutaway section. So from there, we were asked to do every week, they were given a part of a project. So 1 week, do this drawing. Second week, turn that into a painting, or turn that into a lino cut, on a print. Do a print. So this is a lino cut print that you have of that, and then finally make a model. But in that process, also we are asking them to introduce a program. This is a ridiculous program here. It is for a manicure center for dogs. Okay, so the dogs will come in, they will be manicured, and then they will be sent out. So the idea is not that because it's ridiculous, because you're forced to think about other usage other than human beings. You're forced to think about other scales because you're not at the same scale as a dog would be. You are actually asked to think about, a program which does not automatically go with the form that is there. Okay, so in transforming this, you're also thinking that program and site are two different things. They do not automatically normally come together. You have to force them together. And this is the whole idea. So eventually it comes up into this model of a landscape, with various bits. This is a plaster cast that was created by the student. This is one student's work. So the plaster cast, the casting methods are all here. And then, you end up with the plaster cast and with a little bit of a kind of a text inserted into it as well. So this process shows that the architecture is about that play, about the insertion of things, about accidental introduction of things as well. Okay, another thing is this, so what it's also telling us is that, how do we understand things which are not there already? You visualize, you kind of bring that in. So for example, that we were looking into a second year project here. That previous one was a 4th year project. This one is a second year students working on homelessness. So the idea was looking at homelessness as this first start. So some of the early starting work was, and this is early stages of computer generated work as well, visualizations, just around the turn of 2000. So about, when the homeless people are there, we don't, we see them, but after they've gone from that location, we don't see them. But could the traces be there? When I come back, when I say, well, yeah, I thought that there was a person sitting here, and he was, smoking a cigarette or sitting here or lying in a, rag or whatever, that memory trace, how do I actually bring that back? So this was an idea that, well, can I actually bring those memory traces? Can I revive those? And so this was represencing, if you like, of those ideas. So they were sitting on the streets, they were sitting on those steps. So whether they were sitting, with their back here or whether they had a footstep, because it might have left a trace. So every material can have this impact, if you like. Another one is this one where we looked at a piece of Liverpool street, where we were saying, well, what if, we could actually revive the history of that, the streets, which were cobbled streets, which had taken horse-drawn carts and everything in there. How can I present it? So if I turn that one into a kind of almost an X-ray drawing, I could begin to bring up those rut marks, of those horse-drawn carts and so on. So that was one of the kind of beginnings of, looking into a site and then looking into also traces and deposits, which eventually resulted in a swimming pool kind of work. Okay. Another interpretation idea is that, so we are talking in all of these cases about bringing quite opposite things together. So program comes from a different direction, the ideas come from a different direction, the site comes from a different direction. Here it is about Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. There is it's a very well-known short story, and where a traveling salesman suddenly gets up in the morning, he has to travel out, but he realizes that he cannot move off his bed because he's been turned into a giant insect. So it's a very metaphorical story, but it's a very, very important, sort of understanding of one's own condition. And so he is left there on the bed, eventually dies, and kind of shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and the family then eventually discards him once after his death. But prior to that, everything happens from the bed. He cannot get out of the bed, which is something that he never realized, that, the world that is now realized from the bed. So the window that he never saw through, out to the industrial street out there, all the picture that was on the wall, which he never really focused on, those are the kind of worlds that he begins to focus on. And so this whole idea was that, how does this Kafkaesque world open up? So there is this dreary industrial world outside of the window, and then there is this sort of almost a promise of, if you like, paradise, a kind of beautiful world where there is a picture of a landscape and a woman, and so on. How does these two worlds come together? So the idea was to look into those two and construct different models, out of it. So there were these various models being constructed, and just a small example, and then it eventually led to the construction of a nightclub. So the nightclub uses one of the many, many disused tunnels. Underneath Liverpool, there are many tunnels, railway tunnels mainly, where very early on, because between Liverpool and Manchester, where the first trains ran, there were loads of these tunnels. And some of those are still disused, and we were trying to make use of it. So one thing that I point out on the left-hand side is that indeterminate sites do not necessarily always have a shape or a form, and you make it, from there. So this idea of the Kafkaesque space, which, again, the nightclub could have been, one of the good examples where this sort of, illusory world and this sort of realistic, hard world can come together in conflict. So then another idea that I would like to talk about here is that, from Louis Kahn, the Indian Institute of Management. Again, thinking and keeping this idea of the instrumental, the rigid, the grid, the rhythm, the type intact. Those who have seen the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, it's one of the, I think, masterpieces of modern architecture, which some of that was being slated to be dismantled and destroyed. Thankfully, it has been, I think, arrested at this moment, so it's not going to be pulled down. Mainly the House of Residence. But if you look into it, there is a very strong geometry. There's a strong grid on the plan. But you realize you only experience the building through a rhythm, the rhythm of these pillars and posts and so on, the rhythm that is brought in by the sunlight, the very strong Ahmedabad sunlight, and always this sense of incompleteness. It's a ruin. It is incomplete. It is deliberately broken up, at points where the box will never be completed. And then there are the apertures and openings and so on. So the building is always experienced through space. And the space is sometimes very tall, beyond the human scale, sometimes squashed down. So this modulation of scale is what brings the geometry alive. Another one is the very incomplete one, incredibly incomplete looking one, is this really brilliant Greek architect, Aris Konstantinidis, on the left-hand side, where this weekend house was one, and he built several other projects like that. But if you look into it, this is on the Greek sort of coast as a small little weekend house for somebody. And you can see that there is this play of strong sunlight, so which makes it an incomplete ruin. It never looks like a complete building. At the same time, it also has, if you look into the plan, it has got a standard type, that is normally used in Greek sort of coastal weekend houses or coastal tourist houses. So this idea of a sort of core and a corridor or a veranda, that's what he uses, but he puts it into this kind of almost like a device. It's like a machine that modulates shadows. It's a shadow making machine, effectively. And that's what the incompleteness is about. On the other hand, in the 1960s, again, you would probably know Alvaro Caesar, a very important Portuguese architect, built a lot and still alive. he did this beautiful piece of swimming pool, starting with a swimming pool and a small little cafe, which is in Leca de Palmera. And this is really built into the rocks on the sea beach. Beautifully constructed piece, but essentially incomplete. So the idea of the incomplete is in a way to complete, in this case, the rock formation that exists there. So there you have the kind of undulation of the sand there. You've got the undulation and the morphology of the rocks. And then cut into it is this beautiful structure of the swimming pools. So in our close to India, and close in India, close to our heart, is this the Chandigarh capital complex, where what Corbusier essentially does, Le Corbusier building it in the 1950s, is that he uses very basic forms, primal forms. That's why I'm saying primal fragments, bits. So you can see this, this tower here, which can be read as a cooling tower. Okay. On the left-hand side, there is a pyramid. Now, the cooling tower and the pyramid are from two different times, and yet they're connected. They're compositionally, they do not necessarily look beautiful. And this is, again, you have to ask the question of what is beauty, because, and that's one of the things that we should be realizing, that more and more that, we have been imposed with so many preconceptions from the colonial past that there are certain things that look beautiful, and therefore we should follow that. And I think this is a very good lesson about why that should not be the case. On the other hand, also that, I talked about this sort of fragments and parts. So not only that these volumes are fragmentary, but the plan, they're little bits of rooms, one room here, put within a bigger grid and so on. So you're creating these kind of rooms within rooms, boxes within a box, bigger box, and then adding things to it. So the front pylon here is really an addition, almost completely independent of the rest of the building. So this way of fragmenting things, putting fragments together, adding little bits together to make this building is a kind of great lesson from here. That happens in his courtroom buildings. When you look into the rugs that hang behind the judge, or originally was supposed to hang behind the judge, has been mutilated quite a lot. They were all done with little parts, of Kashmiri rug, and then they were woven together. And as you can see, Cobb's own designs actually talk about that as well. All this goes back to his 1920s work on the purism, the idea of purism, and this, what he used to call the esprit nouveau, the new spirit, the new sort of way of thinking about life. And that essentially was about this fragmentary forms coming together in different shapes. They're not all elevations, they're not all plans. There are a combination of plans, elevation sections, perspectives, so on, which are morphed together, slightly different from some of the other work that was happening prior to that in Cubism, but very, very important though. Same, when you look into that, his use of fragmentary forms, again, big boxes, stuff put into it. So if you look into this, what is known as the Southern House in Ahmedabad, very incomplete building. You can see that on the outside, it's open, almost no enclosure. There's no facade, you can say. Everything is kind of retracted back into the building. You can see the interior, how fragmented and broken down it is, how open it is. But also there are interesting things that are happening. As you can see on the right-hand side, that there is this little, toilet. This is a toilet for the guest. Now, everything else is orthogonal, rectangular, okay? Only the toilet is in a curved shape. And that is a toilet, it's not a special space. If you look into here on the left-hand side, this number 11 is actually the servant's toilet, okay? Again, a toilet, but given a special form. So one is that there is this sort of questioning of the spatial organization, that we have been taught that function has to be done like this, that first, most important things like living rooms, bedrooms, they come in a particular organization. Toilets can be pushed back to the end, okay? But here he's saying, well, why should that be the case? But also the other thing that he's asking the question about is that why should servants have a poor deal? So in this case, the servant or the guest who are outsiders, the others, who are given special forms. So giving the form gives them a kind of, if you like, a degree of emancipation, a degree of freedom. But essentially, all about fragments there. Okay. Again, another building in Ahmedabad is the Mill Owners Association. Again, the same thing happens here, that mostly it is about bits. All these things are concrete bits, and then there is this really interesting thing, which is the toilet. This is a large meeting room, and then there is a toilet. You go up the ramp, you come to the main space, and then you have this toilet overlooking the river. So the toilet being the kind of place where impure water, and then the river, allegedly pure water of Sabarmati, you are putting that next to each other. Okay. So, and that is, the toilet is all held around this one central column, and the column actually extends out to the rooftop. And the way the form then works, think about that Esprit Nouveau, the purism drawing that I was showing you, that, it is really about these different forms coming in section and plan and elevation. And this is like a giant spindle. It's a giant kind of spindle for the textile mills, because this was a mill owners building, Mill Owners Association building. Therefore, this spindle, with this sort of toilets in the, cusp between this column in the middle and these curved walls, makes that piece, that cubist, that purist piece, that actually transforms the building into something symbolic. So it is no longer just a building functioning there. It questions the role of the, spatial hierarchy, toilets in the main space. What is that? And then also it asks the question about, purity. Asks the question about also the very important thing that I don't show here is that it actually brings, if you like, the liquid, down to the site. I will not go into that detail now. Now, this idea that, what did I say, that, this building now almost rotates around this pivotal point, fulcrum, I would say, a kind of anchoring. This site never had, this was virgin land where these buildings were coming up. So in order to create a site and to locate the building, he needed to ground it somewhere. So this column that goes through that is the really grounding element, this particular element that actually anchors the building to a non-site. So this idea, which we took to this bigger site that we, again, a thesis project done by two students in the I think it's 2002 or so. And we looked into a German, sorry, this is a fourth-year project, not a thesis project, beg your pardon, but where we actually looked at a big site where there was a medieval town on one side in Halle in Germany. And on the other side, there was this socialist blocks which came up. So there was the river in the middle. So the river in the middle, the medieval site on this side, and the modernist socialist blocks on this side. So this was a whole site. So the central bit was actually used as an anchoring point where we actually created a building which will never change. So the idea was that anchor will not change, fulcrum will not change. It has to remain there. And so there was a kind of a piece of research institution that we created here. And then the rest of the buildings was to do with revisiting the medieval town and looking into the connections with the socialist thought. Now, then we took this one from the buildings and from drawing stage to a actual making, one-to-one construction. So one is that is probably the architects, as far as the architects would go, And here what we did is that we understood the medieval town had walls, and these walls came down, new walls came up, again, it expanded. As it expanded, it created new boundaries. So this motorway that now during the Soviet period, the socialist period, when that ran through, that cut through the whole of the medieval structure or came over it. So what we were saying is that what if we were to actually use this height as a way of understanding and measuring how the site expanded over time, okay? And that's what we were trying to do here. So when you bring that back into the School of Architecture, you're constructing it within our courtyard, it is no longer in the city. It is now in the building. So it has to be part of the domestic situation. So we have transformed that. Even the one-to-one now we are constructing is not a model anymore, it's the real thing. Okay, so we are constructing that where we said, well, buildings actually go out. Like if you look into the right-hand side, we go out with little bits in the Victorian buildings. Extensions took place at different points. Like, first of all, in the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, there were toilets. Then there were conservatories. And then there were conversions of these things and so on, and landscapes and so on. So this outriggering that we talk about here, this outriggering is something that we wanted to explore by looking at one piece here, then another piece here, then for other pieces on the floor and so on, and then measurements. This is a top view of this construction. But also this idea of expansion of the city, which we took up through projections. So expansion of the city was projection of the city, right? So we were looking into how light projections and image projections could be worked out. So we started off from the toilet downstairs, which is no longer a toilet anymore. But from the toilet, we projected images across the courtyard, and then that reflected back across to this wall. And so by doing that, so first of all, it projected out here. It then projected out to the wall out here. Then it projected back into that wall through reflection. So by doing that, you're enlarging the size of the image as you went through from one thing to another to another. And that is the way that we wanted to look into the constant expansion of the medieval city and how can you measure it. So this vertical element that we created here, which is there, was actually a kind of piece of measurement that we wanted to introduce. Now, this grounding issue that I talked about, that how do we actually locate a building into the ground? Sometimes we sculpt it into the ground, sometimes you ground it by introducing an element, as I showed you. Here, of course, though she is Sangat, the studio, is actually sculpted into the ground, as you can actually see that. But also in the way that the drawing is constructed, actually shows how the building or part of the building is actually taken and considered to be part of the ground itself. So in a way that by pulling the ground up, you're almost showing what is below the ground, what is in the kind of cave-like space. And as we know that some other projects where he has used the cave-like space, quite effectively, and he has been interested in the water wells and so on. So this idea of grounding and sculpting into the ground is important. Something that we do in this student project, it's on the other side. Birkenhead is on the other side of the river, from Liverpool. It's Liverpoolians will call it Liverpool, but the Birkenhead people will vehemently oppose it. But there are these various spaces that we wanted to, what was happening in Birkenhead area. And this is in the early 2000s that we saw that out-of-town developments, which are like big sheds, like departmental store type sheds, would come up. And those were actually breaking the fabric of the city quite a lot. They were coming up, taking big chunks of the city, and therefore they were destroying the rhythm of the city, the ruin, the kind of the rhythm, the proportion of the city, and so on. So how do you stop them? Of course, you don't want to stop them by literally saying, well, no, nothing is there. What's the architectural resolution to that? So what we said is that there are particular points within the city where we'll construct architectural pieces which will obstruct or stop this out-of-town development. So these would be actually a very thin, almost wall-like pieces of construction, that would house particular kind of functions, but also they will negotiate landscapes. So for example, here there was a difference in land, levels, and this was kind of brought in from a lower level to an upper level. And also if you think about the staircase, think about how it goes from a narrow to a wide staircase. So it's as if you are actually pushing out the land to go up from the lower level to the upper level, and that the weight that is there, is heavier at the lower level where the depth is more of the land, and therefore the pressure is higher to the level up above where it's opened up. So even small little things like this, designs of staircases, can actually make a big difference to how we understand the landscape and how we understand grounding. Okay, another piece from the same project is looking at these kind of points within the city, because this was a large piece of the city. So we were looking at particular points where we were going to introduce these elements. And here again, this is a kind of railway cut and a landscape, partly built landscape, partly it's a natural landscape, where we wanted to construct that corner and hold the corner by creating this sports facility, a leisure facility with swimming pool and other gym and other things, partly cut into the ground. Now, part of that was actually also a way of people passing through. Therefore, you would become interested in coming into the gym, doing the gym, and so on. So these part models, these were all constructed as part of the design process. Now, how do you actually understand that? And one of the great things that happened with this one is that not only that this piece was like this, but when you turn it around, you can start to visualize that there could be other opportunities given by this little model. And this, as you can see, is a part model. It's a fragment model where we are looking into really how it connects up with an existing piece of retaining wall. So again, a drawing kind of connecting with that. Just next to this is how am I doing for time? Am I okay to go on for another 10 minutes?
Yes, you can continue, Professor Bandhavadh. You can continue.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So the other thing I mentioned is the fabricated site. Yeah. So I mentioned that briefly, but I didn't have the drawing to show in Le Corbusier's Mill Owners Association that the site was fabricated because the site was virgin land. So virgin land didn't have a history. So therefore, you actually have to employ something, instill something into it. Now, here in Charles Collier's British Council headquarters, which was done in the late 80s, early 1990s, which is this sort of giant facade, and again, when you look into the facade, you wonder, is this a kind of modernist cubic column? Is this, if you come closer to it, you can almost read in the facade, in the kind of the cladding, the stone cladding, the sandstone cladding, you can see a hint of the columns. So is it like a kind of classical cornavent with columns coming down? Or is it like a face with two eyes, mouth and a nose? What is it? So it can almost be three things from three different periods: a colonial period, a kind of postmodern period when the 1990s belongs, and a kind of modernist period. So, the question is ambiguous, and that is why it is interesting. And more so, what happens is that really the entire focus of this one, in the way that the landscape is organized, focuses on that sculpture right at the back, which is this sculpture of Shiva, which was created by Hodgkin, if I'm not mistaken, Howard Hodgkin. And so the building effectively is a non-building. The building, you pass the building in a view, you pass the building through, and you focus on that one. So the building is negated in a way. Okay, but what is interesting about this building is that this thing, there is upper level over here is this the library. You go next behind this wall, you disappear up the staircase, you go into the library. Okay, when you come out on this sort of front, on the deck out here, you appear, to the city. So in a way, it is like a kind of giant stage set, where it's a political dimension. One would say that, if you think about what's the objective of British Council, really prepares students to go out to imbibe the British culture, to imbibe the British knowledge system. It's got good sides, but also it has got a political side to it, that they become mouthpieces, for Western culture. And that is intended, not a problem at all. But the issue is that when you're coming out of the library, then you're facing the people on the street. And you're a different person, therefore you're higher up. You're enlightened, you've had that knowledge, that the particularly directed knowledge, but you're higher up. So you're on a stage, you're on a theater stage, performing back to the city street. Okay, and every indication is there in this whole thing, including props, including the way that the facade has been created with a little bit of jutting out, almost like a kind of stage prop. So it is a stage set through which you're entering. So one thing is that it is it's making a political comment on the role of the British education system within third world countries situations. Okay, and on the other hand, what it does is that it goes into this very introspective world, of the landscape at the back. Now, in all of this, what is clear is that there is a kind of instituted, if you like, a kind of quasi-Mughal garden-esque thing. Things have been transformed. What is water is now, pieces of, pathways and so on. But nevertheless, this is the kind of dominant piece leading to the sculpture here. Okay, the building almost becomes like a gateway or darwaza, So, and that's why I think the theater is so important here. But what happens in the back is that it becomes almost this introspective world, where almost a kind of experiment is being carried out. So if you look into the kind of the British infatuation with the Oriental, the kind of investigations that were going on around that time in the 1800s, which was very clearly interested in what is this other thing about? What do they look like? What do they shape up? What are their habits? What are their cultures? And that kind of almost this introspective research, introspective sort of world of Orientalist investigation is what makes up this insight. So there are sort of two different worlds, and two different worlds, let's not forget, is being constructed at a very, very difficult time in Indian history. When, we're moving from a kind of secular world to a gradually, if you like, a right-wing, more fundamentalist sort of attitude from both angles, from, Hindu and Muslim ends. And that is something that becomes clearer in the way that the construction is, in the way that the Mughal garden works, as opposed to the vertical piece of the Shiva, and so on. So there are quite a few things that can be discussed in this particular one. But my main point is that the site is being fabricated. There's no history to the site. So therefore, you put in a new landscape, a historical landscape. It makes it Delhi, if you like. Yeah. And then that is a Mughal garden. And then you put also the sculpture. The question about the vertical and the horizontal is a very, very important one. So there is a political interpretation, both on a kind of investigation of the British historical influence, as well as the kind of contemporary political situation in the 90s. So just this idea of going back to something that I mentioned, measure. How do we measure things? One of the things about architecture is that it measures. It actually understands, what have I done more? What have I done differently? How does that change? So this one is a very quick one about, again, a slightly political situation, because in the 2010s, there is, as the European, more and more European, this was before the Brexit, of course, more and more European workers, laborers came in from Eastern European countries as it opened up. And they did the poorer work, sort of fishing, some of the aspects of like gathering cockles and those kind of things so very low paid jobs. And that happened a lot in the eastern coast, along the eastern coast of UK. And so this one was actually about a fishing center for fishing boats, coming in. They will actually bring in their fishing, you fish, and then they will actually be unloaded, and they will go out again and so on. So there was two things. One is that, main thing was that to understand the landscape is very, very flat. And then there is this sort of industrial landscape around it. So what the whole idea was that this building will be constructed in 3 levels. So you go from the water level to the level of the deck and to the upper level of the building in here, where you will be able to see the landscape from different heights. And therefore, you'd be able to see the extent of the landscape in the horizon and its relationship with the water, beyond that, from different levels. So therefore, you'll be able to measure the relationship between land and water in an architectural way. So that was the idea of this one. Again, as I said, that indeterminate site, I will come to this one in a moment. So tunnels, for example, is something we've been very keen on, interested in. So sites do not have to be overground. Sites can be underground. Sites can be underwater. And I'll come to that in a moment as well. So this one is actually about a big project, again, a 2-student thesis project, where this is the final presentation. You can see models, you can see all kinds of working draw material and so on, and the final drawings is over here. So partly using a kind of disused tunnel, looking into how to revive that. So there are points of connection with the land above, but you are really establishing infrastructure. So architecture here is not so much buildings. Architecture here is about infrastructure. Like in the previous cases, I was saying architecture is urban design, architecture is urban intervention, urban fragments that you're dealing with, large urban fragments you're dealing with. In this case, it's a large urban fragment, but essentially an infrastructure fragment. And in this particular case, this is, as I said, that underwater, sites can be underwater. So this is a thesis project where, there is currently, because of, as you know, with, many places where there have been hydroelectric interventions made, industries set up, you've had large areas of habitation has gone underwater. Okay, in this case, this Rutland Water is actually a place where there was a small village that's all underwater, and it's now a big pool, and that actually feeds the hydroelectric power station there. So if we were to actually understand the archaeology of that site, if we want to investigate that, what could we do? So the students' project was this creation of these modules, these modules which will go underwater. But essentially what the underwater, this is a section of that underwater module. The body is here, okay? So essentially what you're doing is prosthetics. So, for example, that, I can only project my voice now with this microphone, right? So it's an extension of my body. An umbrella is an extension of my body, okay? So this kind of idea that, prosthetics could be extended. So the person who is based here can actually, by using levers and handles and switches and so on, could actually operate a whole series of investigating devices. For example, that, picking up fragments of debris from underwater, you can pick it up here, or to actually record a resonance, you can actually do that here. So all this comes into this particular volume. It's almost like a kind of, sort of underwater piece, which can be then hoisted up, and then the person can come out, but then another piece can go out and do the investigation. So it's an archaeological investigation device, but essentially it's an extension of the body. So body technology as an extension of the body. That's why I'm saying embodied technology here. Okay. I might actually skip this one. There are some, this is a more recent project, and I will just go to this one. I talked about fragments of spaces. There are separate spaces, how they can be connected up and so on. Here there is another piece that I think would be about extending the space, distending the space. And what I've done is, what I'm looking at here is Charles Correy's Liver Pavilion, which was built in the late 1950s and then dismantled, of course, but it was built for the Hindustan Lever Company. Now, if you look into the stenciling on the wall, and it is actually quite a, it anticipates postmodernism by, 20, 30 years almost. And what it does is that it's like a warped crate. It's like a cardboard box. Now, this was supposed to be a temporary pavilion. So it is temporary. How do you actually translate temporary? Here he uses concrete. So concrete is not a temporary material. But the way he uses the form, that is like a crumpled crate. So you've got a cardboard box where stuff have come in. You have now you're throwing it away. So you crumple it, you throw it away. So in crumpling it, the stencils have actually broken up. So part of that is here, part of that is there, part of that is available here, and so on. So this crumpling, is about the temporary, throwing away, discarding, okay? So what is happening here is that it's a lateral translation, a kind of sideway take on this idea of the temporary. So they said it needs to be temporary exhibitions. He said, yes, I'll do the temporary exhibition. I do it in concrete, but I do it in this way. So this crumpled nature is essentially part of not a form making, but an idea of this temporary. But also the way that then the building actually works with a passage right the way through as you go in and you come out, it actually does not create a space separate from another space. It actually extends a space, almost pulls it out, elongates the space, and it thins out the space within that bigger volume. So the bigger volume actually holds a thinner space which has been extended out, like a kind of string, elastic piece. So again, a lateral example of a lateral translation would be this one, where I have, the Charles Corrier's Gandhi Memorial Museum. Gandhi's simplicity and the kind of natural, the kind of idea of going back to the ground, earth, is explained or translated in this large horizontal plane. So everything that happens is enhancing the horizontal plane. Even the piece of bench that you have is actually about highlighting the horizontal plane. Okay, and then the other one is this very lightweight filler, which translates some of the kind of other structures that used to be there from Gandhi's earliest Sabarmati ashram, which are translated as these fragile pieces of insertions, in lightweight timber and lightweight material. You can see that as the horizontal is highlighted here. And so this idea that monuments, we always think about vertical. In this particular case, the monument is a horizontal one. So the horizontal monumentality is something that's a lateral translation. You're not saying, you're not literally translating exactly what it was there. Okay. And so I will come to this final piece about this lateral translation and about looking into a large site. Again, a project with 3 girls working on a thesis project here 2 years back. It's a very interesting project in Dubrovnik. So we work we do not make a distinction between sort of conservation sites or, his new buildings. We essentially think that we, as architects, we need to contribute towards design. We need to contribute towards making change, and the change could be very subtle, the change could be very prominent. In this case, we have the Dubrovnik city, which was a medieval sort of walled town with pretty much faces Venice on the other side. So Venice is on the left-hand side, if you like, and the walled city is over here. The port comes in here, and then there is this large sort of promenade in the middle, very dense housing and so on its side. What we realized is that we are going to actually work with this side, because that was the kind of area where there was quite a lot of ruins. There was, the structure of the site was becoming undefined. And so we wanted to restore that. We wanted to kind of rebuild the grain and the structure of that site. So quite a lot of investigations about the urban fabric, the kind of things that I was showing you at the beginning with the project in Spain, where we analyzed streets, we analyzed patterns, we analyzed rhythms, and so on and so forth. We analyzed also, where does these changes, what are the key buffer elements? What are the kind of elements around which things begin to orchestrate? Those ideas about fulcrum points, what will we consider to be more important? And one very important thing here for every student of architecture is making models. These people made literally 30 or 40 models, at different scales, different sizes. These are bigger models, then there are smaller models. They have been incessantly making models. The making models and making decisions through models is what was excellent about this work. Okay, so there were 3 sites that we considered around this sort of length of it. So there was one site here, which we wanted to bring in some urban agriculture and sort of concentrate. So we were not talking about proposing or building up everything. We were just hoping to arrest, but at the same time introduce new program to it. So this would be about urban agriculture. The next one in the middle, which already had a medieval institution and part of the university, we wanted to strengthen that area with an urban square and kind of create a kind of institutional zone. And the third one at the far end, where we wanted to introduce a new piece. Now, and I'll come to that in a moment about this new piece, because what happens with most of the medieval towns and the historic cities is that, no one comes to see every day, this fantastic history. You will only come to see fantastic history for a few times, and only a very, very small number really are interested in that fantastical history. The rest come to enjoy it, the rest come for their daily life. So what we were struggling right through the project was, what is the everyday thing that will actually attract people de facto into this site? So you can see also the other thing that they do is that photographs are models. So you take a model, you take a photograph of the model and then you work on it. So in this case, the photograph is then kind of drawn over and sketched over so that you can begin to understand how changes could be made. So very good examples of that. And I think it's a very interesting way of working with models as well. So we looked at different things. So the final thing, as I said, that farther side where we wanted to do something different. So there was one thing that we wanted clearly was there was this bastion, and this was a hollowed out bastion, or possibly could be hollowed out. We wanted to put a theater in there, and then this would actually create a link back onto the port edge, onto the promenade. So through that wall and everything else, we would actually create this. Essentially, a lot of that will be left as ruin, but we will burrow in, cut into it. And what we wanted to do, therefore, is that sort of archaeological, historical investigation of the site and of, what this, a museum, if you like, very simply, would all go underneath the wall, underneath the ground. What will only remain above the ground in terms of historic remains are some of those little bits. But then, essentially, staircases and other things will go in and out of it. Okay. But what will stand on top is a really interesting piece. So below this, so you can see the section through the building. Again, the three girls worked incredibly well. So this is the theater burrowed into the bastion. And then the promenade is, the wall walk, is maintained on top. Here you can actually walk across and along the wall, city wall. But underneath that, there is a theater, so you can drop down into it. You can go into the foyer, go into the main space, and so on and so forth. You can do that. Then there is a older building which was sort of created into a bar, which will be part of this. But the bar has this incredible cellar, which goes vertically right the way up. So it kind of becomes a display of, the cellar becomes a display in itself. And then the archaeological sort of museum, goes below it. It is essentially eventually surfaces, but you don't realize that because as you walk above this. But essentially by this time it has surfaced, but it's still held behind the city wall. But then as you go down, so that the whole thing starts off going down here, but down a staircase and a lift as well. Then you go down, you process through the building, you see things at depth. You can go down to the lower level, or you can walk at a higher level, then process out at this moment, or you can actually progress through this and process out here. Now on top, what happens is a very lightweight structure, which is held above this with, structurally kind of quite interestingly, and that is a sort of shopping piece. It's a mall. It's a kind of it's a mixture of everyday mall, everyday shopping, and a kind of specialized shopping. And it happens in a very lightweight structure above it. So it becomes a kind of glowing, if you like, a kind of like a glowing lantern. It's a kind of a beacon, within this space. So at night, it will glow and it will actually create this sort of incredible environment around it. But people have to come here because they have to shop, because nobody can live without their daily provisions. Nobody can live without their, going for, to buy a pair of trousers or a skirt or whatever. And they can actually do that here. Yeah. In that process, they can also buy specialized items because they also, if they want, they can actually visit the museum. They don't have to go for that. Okay. So this idea of a lateral translation of how a building can actually be, a site can be invigorated by not by saying, well, we should make it a historically important site, therefore it has to do this. And the building does not necessarily, it takes its cues from the existing site and its scales and so on, but essentially a manifestation is a modern one. Okay, so this is where I think, and this is a kind of model, again, a beautiful model, and it's still in my office at this moment. So it's a beautiful model of this kind of hung planes, around a steel skeleton structure, which is held up, on top of the kind of very solid pieces that go to the ground. You can see here some of the detailings of, how these things work. But for a thesis for us, technical details are not important. The thesis is mainly about how do we actually take the ideas to the kind of the level of manifestation. But this is where, this piece exists on top of a kind of this museum or a gallery space, in a very interesting way. And then there are sort of small kiosk-like spaces which are selling everyday stuff on the street. So on the ground, it's a market. Above, it's a market, but below, it's an archaeological gallery. And that's really where I would stop. So very quickly, if I can, I need to unshare. Is it unshared? No, not yet.
We wish to hear you more projects, but I think.
No, I'm going to stop now, but I'm just going to unshare, but I'm not finding.
Okay.
It should be at the top of your screen, Professor
I will do it for you. I will do it for you.
Okay, just 1 second.
I will do it.
I think if I go for this, yeah, I got it. That's fine. Has it unshared? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So just two or three things to end up. Sorry, I think I've taken up a long time from you. That, again, going back to the idea of site, that I think I've shown you examples of how we're constructing sites, how we have to play with the site, but playing meaningfully, that is that keeping in mind, why am I actually, what's the role of the building of the intervention, in all cases, and how can we retain the meaningfulness of that. And the other thing is that the whole idea of translation of the problem, that's where the lateral translation of issues come in. How do we break it down? Do we actually bring in a political commentary? Do we bring in a social or a cultural commentary? Do we bring in a commentary of the past? And those kind of things will happen. Or how do we actually see a program, the different parts of the program? And the final thing is also to do with the process, the architectural process, where drawings and models, and how we can manipulate drawings and models, how we can use the methods of drawing and methods of modeling as a way of investigation or interrogation. These are the three things I would like to highlight. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure, even for the extended time that we've taken, which only adds to the points that you raised. I request Dr. Moina Ghosh to put the threads from this presentation and have a.
Excuse me, Monish, you are not very clearly audible.
I would request now Dr. Moina Ghosh to take strands from the presentation and open up the question answer session and discussion thereof.
Thank you, Monishda, architect Monish Chakraborty, for this wonderful, what I would say, discourse to interact with Professor Shaumen Bandyopadhyay. And I just got, into this beautiful flow of looking into beautiful projects and works. And then the wonderful topic of humanities, architectural humanities. Very, I don't remember hearing about it much, when we talk about architectural pedagogy or, practicing architecture as such. So it was wonderful. Thank you, Professor Bandyopadhyay, for sharing your projects and knowledge and understanding. I think it was wonderful to deep dive into some of the very intrinsic matters of architecture and spatial design. So I have few questions. I will perhaps take it up intermittently. I'll take up one of the questions by Monish, and which is my question as well. It is to do with the place itself. So what Monishda asked is, is there a connection? Is there a relationship between Liverpool and Birkenhead? Is it something similar to Kolkata and Howrah that we have? Does it influence each other? And my question is something related to that. Is that, does really a place have something to do with the success, the growth, the philosophy of developing, an architectural school, or its functioning, something of that sort? So, Professor Bandyopadhyay, would you like to comment on that?
Thanks. No, that's a very important, interesting question. I think Liverpool and Birkenhead have, yes, more or less a relationship that we have between Howrah and Kolkata. In that Kolkata was the more, if you like, the institutional, sophisticated side of it, and then Howrah had all the jute mills and the factories and everything. And so, if you look into the two sides of the river, not exactly like that, but Birkenhead side of that's where a lot of the shipbuilding, for example, one of the largest shipbuilding yards, Camel Laird, which still goes on, but it used to be the world's largest shipbuilding yard, and that's still there, but that was on the Birkenhead side. And then you have these huge, so what they do is from the river, there are very few places where rivers are as wide as we know in India. Okay, and Liverpool is one of those areas where the river is really, really wide, quite wide, not as wide as Ganga, but still. But then they have these whole series of these docks which go in, sort of water bodies or sort of lagoons going in. That's where the docking all happened, and then so a lot of that is actually on the Birkenhead side, and the Birkenhead side is also generally a poorer area. But farther on, there's like a peninsula. It's called Wirral Peninsula. Part of that towards the west is facing Liverpool is Birkenhead, and then after that, the rest of Wirral is quite wealthy and posh, but it's very rural as well. But so Liverpool and Birkenhead has that relationship. Farther up Liverpool, you have a lot of docks going towards because as you go out, the river comes out to the Irish Sea. Then you have a lot of, because now with dredging and all the issues around, shallow water depths, they have taken the port out. So the bigger ships, because Liverpool stopped becoming a port when the large navigable ships, which are nowadays used with great depths, they came in. Then all these places like Kolkata, and Howrah and other places, they became obsolete. So Liverpool had suffered the same fate, and therefore they had to actually take it out, like Haldia, they had to take it out towards the sea. Now, the other thing that, of course, dealt a big blow before this was loss of the empire, because during the colonial period, Liverpool was the main. It had a population of about 1.5 million at one point, okay, and then it collapsed to about, in the 80s, it collapsed to about 400,000, okay, and now it's gone up to about 850,000, just under a million perhaps, but at one point it was the third largest city in the British Empire after London and Kolkata.
Right.
Okay, so it was that, which then had the big blow when the colonies were lost. About your other question, sorry, I was just going to answer that.
Yeah. I think there's a great similarity. I think it can go into next questions.
No, you asked the question about whether there is anything about the city which lends itself to a school of architecture and a kind of institution. I think that's again a very interesting and important one. Now, Liverpool, Manchester, this area was the industrial heart of the British Empire, right? Because everything was processed there, sent back through Liverpool. Manchester was a processing place, sent back through Liverpool out to the world again. Okay, so that was how Manchester and Liverpool came up. So, if you think about Marx and Engels spent most of his life in Manchester. He did not spend it anywhere else to write, his, works, and he thinking about the industrial poor and so on. And Marx spent his life in London. They didn't spend their lives anywhere else. So the gritty, that side of Liverpool and Manchester, the hard edge, the industrial side, the predicament of the kind of the housing problems, the difficulties of that and so on, is really what underpinned many of the initial university efforts at Liverpool. So the initial the departments were like engineering, okay, public health, those kind of areas where, because Liverpool needed it, or the world needed it at that time. So that was why it was. Later on comes architecture, because architecture was, and Charles Riley as an individual was an incredible influence at that time. He had strong contacts with American institutions as well, and that's how it came up as a school of architecture. And but at that time there were many other institutions which were trying to be, for Nottingham, for example, where I spent a bit of time, Nottingham, the Technology Institute was set up in 1894. But it stopped, after 1930s or so, to becoming a school of architecture. So could have been a long-serving school of architecture again. But Liverpool actually continued that because it was also seen to be a very important, and this was unique within universities, because no universities had schools of architecture. So Liverpool was one of those foremost ones in that way. Later comes UCL, okay? Harvard and others are much, much later. Harvard is 1936 or 38. So it's much later. So in that sense, I think Liverpool was a path breaker in many, many ways for that reason. And also, let's not forget that urban design, as we know it today, started off at Liverpool School of Architecture. So the civic design department that we have is part of the Liverpool School of, so Patrick Abercrombie, the kind of range of people, but also many others who have spent a lot of time internationally planning and designing sites and cities. Right. They've come out of this place. So that is a really good thing. Also, Roland Ross, all the research about public health. Hence, the tropical medicine was very important for us, okay, in Liverpool, and still a very important place. So those utilitarian aspects of research, it wasn't blue sky research at that time. It was about the practical things. How do we address the problems of the empire? And how do we address the problems of the industries at that time?
Right.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's about the whole ecology and, the environment which caters to the whole understanding and leads to the exuberation. One very obvious question which comes in is, do you think that architectural style or this pedagogy or the way we are designing would change post-COVID? Now that's a question raised by Devarup Das. So which is it's like a very, very burning issue right now and common theme. Yeah. Any point
I think one thing that we have realized is that, and we have been, since March of last year, 2020, we've been teaching online, teaching design online, teaching all the other courses online. One thing that we have realized is that there is no alternative to the face-to-face teaching in architecture and in the design disciplines. And you have to hold a pencil, or you have to hold a pen, or you have to hold a digital pen or a pencil to do it. And I think we work, and this is why we emphasize the studio so much. As I said, that our studios are open 24 hours a day. Students spend their lives, they, literally they live there. And that's how, we also go in sometimes over the weekends to teach, and, there are loads of things. But of course, without a doubt, that we have learned great things, like, the opportunity that we have today to discuss, and in such a, easy way to talk across, many, many thousand miles across that, which would not have been possible. So the kind of cross-fertilization of ideas will become more speeded up, I think, with this. I think the digital means have to be made better suited to architecture. I do not think that the digital means are good enough yet. And by that, I'm not saying just BIM or parametrics, but I think the whole issue of how we design and how do we actually retain the way we, because we hold a pencil to design because there is a connection between the hand, the pencil, the paper, the mind, and that actually allows you to have a dialogue. You have almost a kind of interaction with a piece of paper. You can scribble like this, or well, maybe not like that and that. So that is something that I do not think as yet we are being able to do fully digitally. But that means that. But also institutions will need to have a huge investment in a practical way in terms of building up an infrastructure for that. And we are hopelessly inadequate. Even, in our places, we're still, we need more investment, to make the thing work properly. If part of that has to happen digitally. But some aspects of architectural design will probably best not happen digitally, I would say. That's my view.
True, very true. And more so when we are in India, we are talking about digital divide, and there are so many other issues which crop in. Yeah, it's very difficult, but I think we are all coping up with this new paradigm and moving ahead. Professor Bandyopadhyay, you spoke about this in your entire deliberation. You talked about one part where you talked about the instrumental part, which is more straightforward and more, which goes, into a linear process, perhaps. I liked when you said that in many places the drawings shapes up the design rather than the other things. And on the other hand, on the other side, you have this host of, I don't know how to term that, verbally, maybe the intangible or the cultural or the political, all those bunch of other things which are there. So I was it's not really a question, perhaps you can throw some light onto it. I was having a feeling that, is there something to do with, or is there a fact that when we design this, there's a very personal thing attached to it, how I as a person or I as a designer experience the entire thing, or work on that, versus what is local or what is contextual. So would you like to comment something on that? I don't know if I was clear on that, but
No, absolutely. Thank you. And that's again a very important point. And I think we often make the mistake that, we think architecture is a subjective domain, a subjective world, where, we have an idea, personal idea, and that, if the more flamboyant the idea, the better the architecture is. That I don't think is the case. And what I think is important to think about is that, I would just raise the word validity, that, how do I actually validate my idea? How do I know this is the right idea or the good idea or better idea? Not right idea, but better idea than another one. Okay. So one thing is to do with deliberating on options. Okay. But the other thing is also that to locate it culturally, socially, politically, because, so if you think about that, the discussions that, in Kolkata, which is very important, for example, that we have a lot of discussion about films, a lot of discussion about poetry, a lot of discussions about literature, right? We do not, unfortunately, have the same kind of discussion about architecture. We do not deliberate on, why would somebody use this and not another way of doing it? Now that's where the basis of architectural work should come in, that we have to locate it within a culture. Now, we understand certain things, so even if, say, Ravindra Songit, that they still ring true because they are true for us today, certain things, right? That they resonate because they are valid. And that validity is cultural. It's located within the culture. That validity can be added other layers by locating it within politics, as has happened over the many decades, recently, whether it's, the Naxalites have or the communists have taken a different take on Rakta Korobi, others have taken a different take on Rakta Korobi. So, those are really important points, so once we start to locate it within cultural discourse, then it makes it valid. Okay, then it's no longer a personal idea or a whim. And that is something that I would really, and this is why the whole point about the humanities-based work, that it is not, technology does not give us any answer. Technology is also driven by our thoughts, right? Even economics is driven by our thoughts. If tomorrow I think that company is not going to work, the shares will fall, if enough people think that way. So I think that the important thing about locating it within a culture and a society and a politics, and to deliberate on it and to understand what is a spatial thing. At the end of the day, we are only spatial manipulators. We are spatial artists. We are not other forms of artists. We are not a person who can write, we are not literators, we are not musicians, we are not sculptors. We are spatial manipulators. That's the only thing that we know, okay? So we have to locate our art in that, but locate our art in that discourse of the contemporary discussion. So, if something has to be, just because it was true 200 years ago is no longer true. We have to ask that question always. It's not always good to say, somebody was great, but you've got to ask, well, was this person great? So for example, that, Livium building, the building that the front Georgian terrace, and the building that Charles Riley's time built, it's called the Livium building, but we are actually in the process of changing the name because Lord Livium, the first and the second, had pretty dodgy dealings so when they were making, Livium is Liver Brothers, okay, so Hindustan Liver, Sunlight Soap, right? All of that is Persil, Sunlight Soap, everything. So when they started off doing it, they were actually wanting to find cheap labor. They went to Congo, they got into indentured labor, almost slave labor, to get cheap palm oil to produce the soap. So they did that there, they did that in Suriname and other places. So we are questioning that. So what was great 50 years back, Livium building is, we are in the Livium building. It's great. It's got a fantastic pedigree. I do not think that we can accept that anymore. So we're changing those things. So that's why I'm sort of giving the example that it has to be located in the contemporary cultural debate.
Right. Can I ask Dr. Ghosh to have one or two questions and rather a short answer to that as possible, as far as possible, so that we have another 10 minutes of this discussion? Yes, Inankuda.
Yeah. So there's another question which has come in from Shaumadeep. Since Liverpool has a huge fan following for football, how much of an influence has football had in the design or organization of urban built or open spaces in Liverpool City? Now, I was also very curious about that question. If we can have a quick answer.
And can we club a few more questions together?
Yeah. So there's another one which has come in from Shandipa Panda. And she would like to ask, what kind of architectural solutions could be helpful to make buildings resilient against pandemic situations?
Right. And I think Inankushikar Roy has some question.
Yeah, maybe I missed that out in the chat box. Was that written in the chat box?
He wants to say himself.
Okay. So please go ahead. You can ask.
Unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, done. Showman. I have a very basic, very simple question to ask you. We studied together in B college, and after that you went abroad and then you went for your studies to England, UK. So my question is, when you went there, so what was your reaction to how things were happening there, like in terms of, say, approach to design, the process of design, the theories that they taught and we were actually learning in our college? So how things were different. Even today, you are interacting with very different Indian schools of architecture, right? So even today, probably you have the idea of both the sides, like how you do things there, how we do things here. That would be a very, very important input for us, especially for me, who's a new teacher, teaching for the last 3-4 years or so. So can you just explain that? And then there is another question. You have mentioned about some books that you have authored. So how do you get them? So are they available online, or you can help them?
Right.
I got some interesting books there. I saw some interesting titles there. So can you?
Yeah, I think they're available online. Yes.
All right.
Available.
Okay. All right.
And
All right.
And
so we never discussed this thing. Yeah.
Okay.
To Moinak, I would like to say that Enankuda is also a faculty of our School of Architecture, and we are very happy and pleased that he's with us. And so that is also one more point to be added. And Moinak, if you can kind of club together if any other further questions, because we are running a little pressed with time now. I would like to add one very small question when you address them all together, maybe.
Yeah.
Is your design exercise a group exercise?
No, not necessarily. Theses.
You said thesis. Yes. That's a huge difference.
As a corollary, do you use the city of Liverpool as your engagement while conceiving a design problem?
Quite a lot, yes, but not always. No, because we do, for example, this year, 4th years have been working in Budapest.
Right.
The thesis projects are from Bangkok to Hong Kong to different places. First years are working in Liverpool, second years in different places in the UK, third years outside and within the UK. So it depends, yeah. But work in groups, we always have group work. But the thing that is different in the 4th and 5th year is that there is a lot of collaborative work. That is different from the group work in that they work together to develop the design rather than one doing a little part of it, another doing something else. That this is a collaborative work. So that's what Liverpool is quite distinctive about in its approach. Yeah. And then if I can just go back to Enanko, just answering the other question, Enanko's, that I think the big difference was that, yes, I realized that, we were taught in a kind of very, there was a functionalist way of teaching, that there is a program, there is if you have a function like a hospital, that it can only happen in a one particular way. Okay, so that is something that to question that is something that we never were taught, and also the different ways of using drawings and models to experiment with things, explore things is something that we were never taught. And the other thing is that to be pushed to read, because architecture is not something that you just do on the side just because you like it in drawings. It is underpinned by reading and underpinned by cultural thought, and that's why I was trying to draw in these parallels, because we have literally shared sort of the wall between us for many years two rooms next to each other, but the discussions that we had, I only wish that we had taken that into the architectural spectrum, because we never were given that freedom to do that. Yes. And here, I think that freedom has been given. So that is one thing that I would say, and we can have discussions about that later. But that's what I've learned. And I think as to pandemic, whether the pandemic can have any impact on buildings, certainly it will have impact on buildings. But I don't think that human activity will basically change. We will probably, I think we will, and in densely populated areas, we'll still have to continue to live next to each other. So I don't think that architecture doesn't have a role to play as such in a big way. I think it would be problematic to put everything on architecture. It has got its limits, like music has its limits, like every playing instrument has its limits, it stops at a particular point. So therefore, I don't think that architecture can do it. And the other thing is whether Liverpool football and the football clubs, it has had because see, both Liverpool and Everton, those are the two, and originally they were built up like Mohunbagan in East Bengal along kind of ethnic lines, and religious lines. One was Protestant, the other one was Catholic. So therefore, that's how red and blues come in. Okay, so, and they were essentially located within neighborhoods. So the playing fields within neighborhoods, within working class neighborhoods, which became a stadium. So Liverpool Stadium, as you now see still, is still within a dense population area. So there are lots of housing around it, lots of just simple housing around it. And that's where Liverpool is. They're trying to move out of it. Everton is trying to move out of it. The same kind of situation, working class areas. But those have had a negative implication on the World Heritage Site, which is especially the Everton proposal for the Everton Stadium, which will come up in the docks, is something that UNESCO is objecting to. So in a way, it has got that. But of course, Liverpool, two things Liverpool is obviously famous for is one is football, one is music. Beatles, the other one, and not only Beatles, but many others, but Beatles specifically. So Liverpool, those things are part of the culture, part of the DNA of wherever you go. So you can't avoid it.
Oh,
Thank
well,
you
that
so
was
much, Professor
a
Bandyopadhyay.
real, such an experience. And thanks to everybody for this, basically Professor Chakraborty, Dr. Ghosh, and Professor Roy. This one would be etched in our memory. What a conversation, what a presentation. We couldn't have asked for more. Thank you so much, but I would request Director HR Corporate Communications and Industry Connect, Ms. Ina Bose, to kindly give the formal vote of thanks. Then we go from there.
Thanks, Indila. Awesome, Professor Bandyopadhyay. That was really mesmerizing. In Calcutta, probably we'll need some more decades before we can really think of such innovative work. I don't know what's your take on this. I incidentally was involved in a real estate in the real estate industry for a couple of years. That was almost a decade back. So that was the time when Calcutta started looking into modern architecture. Of course, yes, Sector 5 and the Rajarhat New Town, that was the only place where innovative work could be shown, not the ancient Kolkata. Ancient Kolkata is really difficult to make that changeover. Yes, again, a decade back, we first saw the green buildings coming up, more in the commercial sector, not in the residential part of it. And that was in 2011, 12, I'm talking about. But till date, the numbers are very few. Modern architecture, as you call it, other than Newtown, that too very few. You can count them in your fingers. Why can't we motivate people? Monish might be able to answer this. Why can't we motivate people to come up with some innovative thinking, the design thinking part of it? That's my one point. And secondly, maybe to a certain extent, answer to this could be involve kids right from middle school to get interested in it. And again, probably all of us, it's our responsibility to start thinking of having workshops for maybe class 6, 7 upwards to make them think that, yes, this is also a field. What's your take on this, Professor Bandyopadhyay?
No, thank you. That's, I think it's, yeah, it is. I'm not saying that clearly lots have happened in Kolkata and in different parts of India, and there are some really, really good pieces of work coming up. I think what I hope is that that would be largely thoughtful work. So sometimes it's all driven heavily by just one short-term objective of making quick money, and not a longer-term objective of even making money, and that is something that I feel is important. I think there is a social responsibility architecture, and as real estate and builders will have to have, which is not always there. So that is something that the government can regulate on. I think our education schools of architecture have to play a stronger role, and this is where institutions like yours, with a new agenda can come in, not an older agenda of well, we are happy and we live happily there. we know what to do, then I think if the new agendas can come in, that would be really fantastic, because I think students, I feel that generally every young person coming up, growing up, is hungry to know something different and to find something, meaningful, and, to latch on to something that is relevant. And that is something that we are often not giving them. And that is, I feel that that can be done. And I think so, therefore, and the other point is very, very important, that I think truly that if you think about it, that if somebody wants to do literature or maths or, science, then that is taught in schools, right? From, class 8, class 7, class 6, they know all, what is maths and what is physics and what is, biology and so on. But architecture, no. And so I think, and also as I was saying before, that I think if you look into, Bengali culture, which is strong in many, many ways, but sadly for architecture, except Tagore's efforts, in Sriniketan and Shantiniketan, and that too has never been properly understood or criticized. We do not have many cultural debates, even in the past. All architecture almost doesn't exist. We don't want to deal with, and that can be changed by having more debates, or popular journals and so on can actually do that, but in a relevant way, and bringing in other kind of views and so on. That it's not just about past. It's not about just a fantastic future. Architecture is about here and now, today. So I think, and sometimes small architecture can be brilliant. That as I was showing, some of the examples are very, very small things. And if you look into even, Joseph Allenstein, who was the first head of architecture at B College, where we both, Enako and I, were taught. He did the American Settlers House, which was a very small piece, but very understated piece of work, but beautiful piece of work. There are quite a few others, like I'm sure, but it's just that if we can, focus on that, and I feel that schools of architecture can also engage with popular dissemination. Taking the news out, the message out to to the streets. That is important too.
Thank you, Professor Bandyopadhyay. Dr. Ghosh, many thanks to you too for taking out time to share your views with us. Monish, that was an awesome concept of requesting Professor Bandyopadhyay to be with us this evening. Professor Bandyopadhyay, I'm sure you have plans after the pandemic, after the situation gets normal. You have plans of coming down to Kolkata?
Yeah,
and so from all our sides, my earnest request would be to have you at our campus. This new university, of course, it's not architecturally that brilliant, but still our students are brilliant.
No, absolutely. I think every student
you to be with us.
No, absolutely. I would love to. And in fact, after hopefully the pandemic will cede after a little while, but after end of October, I stepped down from my headship, which is a 5-year period. So I stepped down from my headship. So I should have a year-long sabbatical. So that will give me time to probably travel a little more. I mean, I normally travel for my work because I do Middle East and India quite a lot. But it'll be great to, visit your institution.
Yep.
Thank you. Yes, Manish.
Yes.
Do you have anything to say?
I just wanted to kind of make a concluding statement. I used to hear a lot about technology transfer at one point of time from one world to the other. I think time has come to also talk about process transfer, processes of how to teach architecture, how to teach other subjects. And it is here that I particularly am liking the lockdown because I think the process transfer is much easier in this mode of transmission, as well as in future, we hope we will have this engagement between a very old school called Liverpool School of Architecture. I was very pleased to see how Liverpool University's design pedagogy kind of relates to the well-being and the thinking of the city per se, which also is perhaps a need of the hour of colleges in India, which very few colleges in India does it. And I think we intend to do that. And here we would like to learn more of how to do that between Calcutta and Liverpool. The relationship already exists between, as you said, about Birkenhead to Howrah and Calcutta to Liverpool. So I think we would like to strengthen this relationship. I did some progress today in the morning by calling up the British Deputy High Commission, whether we can have some kind of a relationship in the future. And with these words, we tell all the participants that he's going to speak again in a week's time, this time more on specifically on the Hooghly management in the coming week. We really look forward to that, and we would really ask you to come again and participate in these quite an interesting and quite a knowledgeable and quite a penetrating presentation.
Thank you, Manish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks,
and,
everyone.
It's a great honor to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Same here. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.